We've got Shannon Bream standing by. She's on the phone for us right now in what has been about a five-year conversation. The Supreme Court is now setting aside this court ruling, Shannon, against the baker who wouldn't make this wedding cake for that same-sex couple. What are you learning now that you've been able to look at the details here? The Supreme Court ruled 7-2 that Colorado's actions violated the free exercise clause.
Yeah, it's interesting. I haven't been able to read the whole thing. Unfortunately, I'm in my car on the way to the studio. But from what I can tell, we really thought they would be looking back to these statements by the commission, the initial first body that looked at this case and ruled against the baker here, Jack Phillips, because there were some comments by one of the commissioners that really called into question how he felt about this religious issue. And so it sounds like to me in the wording of the opinion that I've seen so far is that this is not a huge, broad, sweeping decision saying that no one ever has to participate in a wedding ceremony, same-sex wedding ceremony, if they're in the stream of business. But it certainly points back to this commissioner and says, if there's obvious religious bias or animus against someone because of their religious beliefs, you can't base a decision on that. And during the arguments, Justice Kennedy was tough on both sides, but there was a very pointed moment where he was talking to the attorneys for the couple and said, you know, tolerance has to work both ways, and I'm very concerned by what I've seen in this case, that tolerance was not extended to Mr. Jack Phillips, the baker, because of his religious beliefs. And you didn't want to pin too much one way or the other on that statement when he made it during the arguments because, like I said, he was tough on both sides, and, you know, you never know if he's playing devil's advocate or trying to still make up his own mind. But that moment really stood out because it was clear he thought that this baker had not gotten a fair shake. It looks like in this decision today, he's pointing back to that language from the commissioner and saying, you know, you can make a decision on these issues, but you can't do it with bias.
And that is noted in the opinion. The opinion was written by Justice Kennedy. Shannon Bream is on the phone with us. Justice Ginsburg and Sotomayor dissented. But he writes in the opinion that the reason and motive for the baker's refusal were based on his sincere religious beliefs and convictions. But Shannon, the court's not deciding on the big issue in this case, whether a business can refuse to serve gay and lesbian couples. Justice Kennedy says in his majority opinion that the issue, quote, must await further elaboration. So what does that mean?
Yeah, and that's an interesting point because I do think he's very narrowly pointing to the language from that commissioner and saying it's clear this first body that made the decision had some bias against him. Now, that doesn't mean we can't relitigate this issue when it becomes maybe a more fleshed out case in the future and you don't have that obvious animus against but we've seen so many of these cases that deal with florists, with photographers, with others, and we thought over the years that some of them were ripe for the court. They didn't take one until this one, and now it's very specific, making the ruling pretty specific as well. But I think it's going to stand for a while because I think that while these kinds of conversations continue going on with the makeup of the court and waiting to see if Justice Kennedy retires, I think that LGBT advocates will be hesitant to bring another case with the makeup of the Supreme Court as it stands today.
Right after this brouhaha just started back in 2015, I had a chance to catch up with Jack Phillips, the baker in question, that ultimately would prompt the Supreme Court decision today. He was arguing on religious grounds and more that he simply wanted to do what he said the Lord was telling him to do. Take a look. When you heard that the Supreme Court ruled, and to your lawyer's point, a 5-4 decision in favor of gay marriage, as apparently a very deeply religious man, how did you feel?
I was disappointed in the court's decision, but it's a different decision than what my case is. My case is the government is trying to force me to violate my personal religious freedom and, you know, create a cake for a ceremony that I have objections to.
Now, in the meantime, let's say you lose this case on appeal, and what they're saying is someone comes in, a heterosexual couple, a homosexual couple, you have to provide for them. No difference. What do you do?
There is no difference. I treat all of my customers the same. I've been doing this for 40 years.
No, I understand that, but you won't make a cake for a gay wedding.
Correct.
Right? You will for a heterosexual one.
Right now, we're not. We're not making any wedding cakes. So that's taken a pretty good chunk of my business away.
All right, so just to be clear, at the time, because there was the dust up over making a cake for a same-sex couple, he just stopped, that is, the baker in question, Jack Phillips, from doing cakes for anyone, a heterosexual couple, All that stops presumably today, or he can return to making cakes for anyone today, most likely heterosexual couples, obviously, in that event. To the attorney who argued this case among the winning team before the United States Supreme Court, Jeremy Tedesco. Jeremy, good to have you.
Thanks for having us on, Neil.
How was this decided, and how did two liberal justices go along? On what grounds?
Well, the court basically said, look, the government shouldn't be hostile to people on the basis of their religious beliefs. That kind of hostility has no place in our society. You know, one of the commissioners in the case, and this is, I think, what really caught the attention of the court, it certainly did of Justice Kennedy at the arguments, actually said at one of the hearings in Jack's case that she found religious freedom to be a despicable piece of rhetoric. And Justice Kennedy asked very pointed questions about that at argument. And I think that idea that the government shouldn't be hostile to people of faith, that they shouldn't be able to bully and push people out of the marketplace simply because of their deeply held religious convictions about marriage. And that garnered 7 votes in favor of Jack Phillips. It's a great day for us. I heard your question where you asked him, what if you lose? And I'm so glad we don't have to answer that question today. Jack Phillips won, and he won in a way that reaffirmed the idea that government has no business punishing or targeting people because of their religious beliefs.
Still, they did go out of their way, the justices, and especially Anthony Kennedy's ruling on this, to not interpret this more broadly than was the case, that this was isolated and not a precedent setter. What did you make of that?
Well, you can't say that Justice Kennedy said it only applies to Jack Phillips. I mean, that's just not true. The reality is the court did go out of its way to say, you know, there's other cases that are going to present the free speech issue about creative expression that we'll reserve for another day. But make no mistake, this is an important ruling. It reaffirms that principle that government hostility towards religion has no place in our society. But it also talked about unequal application of the law, where the government favors some views over others. And that happened in this case, too. 3 Colorado bakeries were asked to create cakes opposing same-sex marriage. Now, they said they didn't want to create them because they supported same-sex marriage, and the Colorado Civil Rights Commission, when they received complaints of discrimination about those situations, said, you're fully exonerated. No discrimination here to see at all. Yet they're prosecuting Jack Phillips to the full extent of the law. He opposes same-sex marriage and is being forced by the government to promote same-sex marriage through his art. There has to be an even playing field for free speech. That's the idea of the First Amendment. And so it's not just the religious hostility that played a part in this ruling. It's also the fact that the state of Colorado is unevenly applying its law, favoring some views, those who support same-sex marriage, over those who oppose same-sex marriage. And the government has no business playing those kind of favorites in the free speech context.
Still, I'm not sure it was so black and white in that regard, Jeremy. Maybe you can help me out here, because I know it was balancing the respect for sincere religious beliefs versus practices that could target persons with further indignities, for example, in the gay community. So if the exact same case were to be brought up in a separate situation, is it such a given that the justices would rule in favor of the individual?
Well, there can't be a given because the court said we're reserving that issue for another day. But what I'm saying is that the court's decision isn't as narrow as some people are telling you. I think there's plenty of principles within that decision that expand far beyond just Jack Phillips. I mean, simply the principle of the government can't be hostile to people because of their religious beliefs is a very important principle. It's great to have that reaffirmation from the court.
But how do you know some people then, Jeremy, won't seize on this and say, all right, on religious grounds, I don't want to make a cake for a mixed marriage couple. I don't want to make a cake for, a mixed religious couple. You know what I'm saying?
Sure. The reality is the court said race is unique, it's distinct, it's special. Race discrimination has no place in our society, and I would suspect that the court would say in the race context, that's not going to be tolerated. But that Jack Phillips one doesn't change what's going to happen in the hypothetical case that arises in the race context. And I think it's also important to understand that it's not like we didn't face that argument all throughout this case. It was in the opposing briefing. It was mentioned in the court. And the court still ruled in favor of Jack Phillips. So, you know, obviously that analogy didn't carry the day, and it shouldn't, because race is different, it's distinct, it's unique. And our society's commitment, historically and constitutionally, to eradicate race discrimination is a special thing that is preserved for that issue. And Jack Phillips winning his case isn't going to upset that at all, and it shouldn't.
Has Mr. Phillips told you what he intends to do now? When I had last chatted with him, he stopped making cakes. Period. Heterosexual or homosexual couples, whether he would get back into the business of making cakes, in this case, for heterosexual couples.
Well, you know, Jack needs to get back into the wedding cake industry. When this ruling came down from the commission, he had to walk away from the wedding cake industry. That was 40% of his business. I mean, he has suffered financially, but also emotionally. I mean, just the toll this has taken on his family, the death threats. His wife, he's told me stories about how his wife couldn't just bring herself to come to the shop because she was so afraid for her life. And so, you know, to have his situation vindicated by the court is just so relieving to Jack. He's going to be able to get back into the industry. I mean, we certainly have to evaluate the decision and advise him on the best approach to do that. But, you know, we're considering all those options right now. But Jack has every intention of getting back into doing the art that he loves the most, and that's creating wedding cakes.
Jeremy Tedesco, thank you very much, part of the victorious winning team here.
Joining us now, Fox News legal analyst Greg Jarrett, author of the upcoming new book, which we urge you to buy again, because we know surely you have already bought it, The Russia Hoax, the illicit scheme to clear Hillary Clinton and frame Donald Trump. How are you?
I'm well. Buy 2 of them. Buy 5 of them.
Now, see, this is what is meant by greed and fear. I'm afraid that Greg is going to get even greedier and up the number here. Good to have you here.
Good to be here, Luke.
Let's start with the SCOTUS ruling, finding in favor of the baker.
Yes.
And against you know, people telling him what he cannot do in his religion, which is what effectively it amounts to.
Yeah, this was the inevitable collusion.
Boy, here we go. Somebody finally found collusion.
Let's call it collision between religious rights and gay and lesbian rights. And the court really dodged it. They ruled narrowly and said he didn't get a fair hearing before the Civil Rights Commission. But there's another case that's coming up in a couple of days, and I think SCOTUS will take it. And this would allow them to rule more directly on the issue.
This is the thing that I love about your racket. Excuse me, legal profession.
It's a racket.
I mean, narrow, broad interpretations. Here's the deal. If you walked into a baker and he said he did not like Republicans or conservatives and therefore wasn't going to bake you a cake or whatever, deny you any service, that's his right, or her right, whomever. I mean, I don't think I would object to that. You know, I mean, you've got a marketplace. Why would I expect to have it my way rather than, you know, it's their joint, their business, whether they're offering a product or a service?
Well, the law has been evolving on this subject for the last 50, 60 years.
I love the way the law evolves.
Oh, it does. It's an elastic, expanding constitution, and it gets interpreted and reinterpreted. And now the latest interpretation is that, you know, tolerance is a two-way street. It's not just we have to be tolerant to gay and lesbian people. We have to be tolerant of people who have firmly held religious beliefs as well.
Of any group, any protected group, as far as I can see. I mean, you know, the law doesn't tell me that I can go out, you know, and just say I want this, or this, come hell or high water, right?
What's interesting is that this particular baker was selling his goods to everybody, regardless of their preference. And so the court, interestingly, one of the justices said, well, that's irrelevant that he did. No, it's incredibly relevant that he was selling everything. He just would not make one particular custom cake for this couple because he felt it was against his religious beliefs. And the court, I think,
wait a minute. I need to understand this because I saw that. I read it too. What's the point? I mean, it's a custom cake that requires him to do certain things. He doesn't want to do those certain things for a gay couple or whomever it would be. I just don't see where there is some way in which you can decide to impinge on a person's private property.
Well, there you see what he does is he puts portraits on the cakes.
Yes.
And that's custom made.
And that is fascinating. But
right. Yeah, I don't know. So the point is that he will sell anything in his store except for something that is custom made, and he has the right, based on religious beliefs, to say, sorry, I can't do this. And that should be a right that should be upheld. Supreme Court has upheld it, but with a condition. They said, well, you didn't get a fair hearing. What if he got a fair hearing? Then what would the Supreme Court's ruling be?
What are they saying?
They dodged it.
They're basically saying then his rights would be somehow diminished if he, based on a different level of a hearing.
Right.
I mean, this is the kind of nonsense that drives lay people, just plain old citizens nuts about this.
Well, and as a lawyer, it drives me crazy. The Supreme Court didn't have the courage to actually rule on the merits.
Okay, rule on the merits equals, in Greg Jarrett's mind, what result? Because obviously you're not completely comfortable with this outcome.
Well, I'm not. I would have preferred that they give a full-throated defense of religious rights.
Right.
To say that there's no exception. It's not a question of a fair hearing or an unfair hearing. But as I said, there is another case that's coming up, a florist.
Oh, boy.
And if they take that case... If they take that case and they actually address the issues as I think they're required to do as 9 Supreme Court justices, then maybe we'll get a good result.
Yeah, look, to me, it looks like the Constitution's pretty clear. You talked about it as elastic and involving, and I look at it as absolute and concrete. And the interpretations that we watch the Supreme Court, district courts through appellate in the Supreme Court, torture reason and common sense in order to get to a conclusion that suits their political impulse of the moment is disgusting.
Well, there's a reason why our founders put freedom of religion and media, press, and free speech number one. They put it as number one for a reason, because it really should be the supreme right.
Now, you're not diminishing number 2, 3, 4, et cetera.
Well, I could if you give me time.
I know, that's where I'm afraid. Let's turn very quickly, if we may, to the president's attorney, Rudy Giuliani, opening up this thing about pardons. And the president, as soon as he heard he heard Rudy, I just knew as soon as Rudy said it, we're going to be hearing about pardons for a while. To the president's great credit, and if you want to understand Donald Trump, in my opinion, you have to look at things like this, the way he handles it. There would have been first a little moaning, one would think, in the White House.
Yeah.
But the president is a man given to inspiration and political brilliance for a guy who says he doesn't want to be a politician. He's awfully doggone good at it. He's out the next day talking about, by gosh, I've got the right to pardon myself if I ever do anything wrong. I mean,
well,
he
makes lemonade out of lemons, and that's what he was doing with Rudy's comment. Look, it was rank speculation, and it was unnecessary.
Why doesn't anybody ever speculate about what would happen if suddenly the Congress of the United States and the Senate had a moment of lucidity and guts and actually said, it's over. Mueller, pack your bags, get those 13 Democrats out of here. We're shutting her down.
Well, that would
require... We got a country to run, and the joke is over.
That would require intelligence, and there's little of that up on Capitol Hill.
I wasn't going for intelligence. Just a moment of lucidity, non-transferable, brief, just a transition moment for them.
Yeah, the fact is that the Constitution's silent on whether the president can pardon himself. The founders left that to us. There was a 1974 opinion.
Greg is going to go for a very long time.
No, I won't.
He won't.
An assistant attorney general.
Let me explain to you why you won't.
Said you can't do that. And what does she know? 1974, Mary Lawton. What in the world does she know?
Do you see what happens? Sometimes we lose Greg when he gets down these.
I'm sorry, rabbit holes.
No. Down these important evolutions, and you create a tree and a branch for all of them.
Sorry.